This is an oral history interview with Korean War veteran Clark Parsons.
1952 to 1956 during the Korean conflict.
Okay. When were you born?
I was born October 11th, 1933.
Where were you born?
In my home. It was quite a deal back then. The doctor came out with a horse and buggy, and my folks paid him off for the birth of me with a couple of bushel of potatoes. Not like that anymore.
Did you have any siblings?
I had one sister, Carol.
What was her age?
She was 2 years younger than I was.
Okay. Have you always lived in Lowell?
Yes, I've always lived in Lowell.
Okay.
Except for the time that I was in the service, and we moved to Wakusta for a short period of time, closer to my work, and the kids went to Grand Ledge to school for a while.
What do you remember about early Lowell and your childhood?
I remember when the high school burned in 1947. My aunt was going to school then, and we could see the smoke from our place. And I was anxious to get started to go to high school. And I didn't know where we were going to go because the school was on fire. And they built one so that we had a place to go when my turn came.
Do you remember any after-school activities?
Yes, my activities after school were football, and I went out for track one time, but I had some problems with my feet. I had some plantar warts. My feet got sore, so I couldn't run. But football was my main event.
Do you recall any major issues that were protested against in your own town?
I don't remember any protesting at that time. I think that came at a later date. Student activities, there wasn't much civil unrest. So the only problem, I guess, was the election time when people were running against each other. And I don't remember any particular thing, no.
Okay. Did you enlist or were you drafted?
I enlisted. You had to enlist in the Air Force because the draft, they took the Army boys and the Marines, but we had to spend 4 years instead of just the 2 years. So I either wanted to go in the Navy or the Air Force. And during World War II, my neighbor flew B-17 bombers, and just before he went overseas, he brought one of those big bombers over our place, and I fell in love with airplanes. So if I knew if I was going to go in the service, it would be in the Air Force.
Why did you pick this branch of service?
Because of my friend activity. He was a pilot, B-17 bomber, and I kept track of that. And then they had some real neat fighter planes. I always dreamed about being a fighter pilot, but that didn't come about. So I ended up in I joined the Air Force and went to Detroit and got sworn in. Then they sent us back home for 2 or 3 days. So we had a 3-day pass right off the bat. And then we went to Fort Custer, and then we went to Texas. And it took us 3 days to get to Texas. We had one of those slow trains. It stopped at every crossing, picked up eggs and delivered milk and stuff like this. So it took us 3 days on the train to get to Texas. And that was my beginning of the Air Force.
How long were you in boot camp or like any pre-training?
Well, I was in boot camp 3 months, and I got pneumonia just before I finished. So I was in the hospital for 3 months, and I lost all the friends that I had because they'd gone on to their classes and different things, and so I didn't have anybody that I enlisted with, so I was brand new again. A whole bunch of kids that were just starting out in the service. And I was at San Antonio, Texas, and there's a lot of air bases around San Antonio. And Kelly Air Force Base was just across from San Antonio, Lackland. And so I was working supply there until my school opened up. We had to take different tests while we were in basic training to find out what we were good at. And so there were 7 different areas, and I qualified the highest in heavy equipment. That's what I really wanted to do. I wanted to be a bulldozer operator or something like that and make runways for the airplanes, but that didn't work out. So this weather school came up, and I thought, well, that sounds interesting. I think I'll go to this weather school up to Chanute. That was in Rantoul, Illinois. So we went to school there during the winter, and it was cold. Boy, it was cold. That wind coming off in Lake Michigan was really frigid. And that lasted 3 months. And after we graduated, why, my first assignment was Korea. So that's where I headed for. And
How did you feel those first few days and weeks?
I guess I was kind of lonesome the first few days and weeks, but we kept pretty busy, so you didn't have time to think about it too much. The old, what do they call them, flight leaders, or anyway, they were in charge of you, and he says, I'm going to be your mother and your girlfriend, and I'm everything. So just look at me as number one. So we looked at them as number one until we got through boot camp.
Do any of your instructors stick out for any reason?
Did they what?
Stick out, like, do you remember one for doing something?
No, they don't. They were pretty rigid. We had GI parties, and I thought, boy, that's going to be neat. When I found out that a GI party was scrubbing the floors on your hands and knees. So that was a different kind of a party than I expected.
How did camp prepare you mentally and physically?
Physically, we had PT every morning. That's how I got pneumonia. We get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and we dress for cold weather because it was cold in February down in Texas. And then by noon, it was 100 degrees. So if you dress for hot weather, then you'd freeze in the morning. So I dressed for cold weather, and then by noon, while you were really hot and sweaty, and that really sticks out in my mind. That's how I got pneumonia. I was in the hospital down there for 3 months. And
which war or during which peacetime era did you serve?
the Korean conflict was the area that I served in. And that lasted for 1 year. They signed a peace accord while we were there in Korea. I was stationed in Seoul at the university buildings. And we took a ship from California over to Fuchu, Japan. That was near Yokohama. And I was kind of wondering how the Japanese people would treat the Americans after not being very long after the atomic bomb had gone off in their country. I didn't know if there'd be any animosity or any hatred for the Americans, but I didn't see any of that. They were very friendly and courteous, and that really surprised me. And we took a train to Fuchu, and then we got on an airplane and flew to Seoul, Korea. Seoul is the capital city of South Korea. And when we landed, they were under a red alert. That means that there were enemy planes in the area. So we had to shut our lights off and circle around for a while until they could turn on the runway. Finally, we were getting low enough on gas where we had to land. So they turned the runway lights on, and we landed, and just as we landed, the sirens were still going off for the air raid alert. And we had to follow the guy ahead of us, and we didn't know where we were going. We were stumbling around in the dark. And we finally got oriented and made our billets for that night. It was quite an exciting landing.
What was your job assignments?
I was a weather observer. And the school taught us that there are 27 different types of clouds. Here's a few pictures of them. There are low clouds, middle clouds, and high clouds. And we had to report on what we were seeing as a weather observer. And then we had to plot it out on a map. And I got an example here of what our job was. This barb out here was the wind speed and direction. Each long barb represented 10 miles an hour, and each short barb was 5 miles an hour. So the wind was blowing from this direction at 15 miles an hour. We had to record the temperature and the dew point and the visibility and the weather conditions. Foggy conditions was just the example. Drizzle was a colon, and a rain was a dot, and a thunderstorm was this symbol. So we would report what was happening at our station, and these were the cloud types that were at the station, and the barometric pressure. Pilots had to know the barometric pressure because when they were landing, they had to know what the altitude was of the airplane. And so the pilots had to get a clearance before they took off so they could understand what was ahead of them. Cloud cover was 3/4. That means that the sky was 3/4 covered with clouds, and if it was clear, why the circle would be clean. Each station had call letters. And this is for Denver, D-E-N. Grand Rapids was G-R-R. And we had to plot this as fast as we could, as accurate as we could, so that the next level of weather people, the analysts, could draw the connecting lines to show where the highs and the lows was and the fronts. And you can see this on television every night. And so it was quite an interesting job. I really enjoyed it.
During your time served, did you see any battles?
The only battle we saw was Incheon was hit pretty hard just before they signed the armistice, and we could see the fire from where we were. But at night we could see the artillery guns firing into the north. Looked like heat lightning. The sky would light up with flashes of, we couldn't hear the report, but we could see the flashes of artillery from where we were.
How did you feel about being so close to that?
I felt different times you have different feelings. At Christmas time, they circled our camp with an airplane, and they were playing Christmas music. And I thought that was really neat. Here we were so far from home, and we were hearing Christmas carols from an airplane that had big boom boxes on the side of it. And it wasn't all scary, but it was, we knew we were in a war.
Did you earn any medals?
Yes, I have a few. That the Korean Service Medal and the United Nations, and Gary Newell just gave us this one last year. It was the 50th anniversary of the war, the ending of the war. And right now, Seoul is more like Grand Rapids than Grand Rapids is. It's really modern over there, cars. And when we were there, why a lot of the buildings. North Korea is still a threat to this country and the world because of their nuclear stance that they've taken. And Lord only knows what's going to happen with that.
Were you able to keep in touch with your family?
Yes. I was never without contact with the family. I wrote quite a few letters and took quite a few pictures, but there was no problem that way.
What kind of food did you eat while you served?
Well, that's another story. We had a mess hall, and it was good food, but once in a while, every Friday night or so, we'd go down to the NCO club and have steak and a good meal outside of the mess hall. But it was fairly good, yes.
Did you have any chores or daily tasks?
Yes, we had to go to work, and we had regular hours, but we worked around the clock. Shift, 2 days on another shift, and 2 days on another shift. So we rotated every 2 days. We never had to pull KP or any duty like that because they never knew what our schedule was and they couldn't keep up with us. So we were lucky that way.
What did you do for entertainment?
Well, they had movies there on the base, and occasionally one of the movie stars would come over for a USO show and put on a program for us.
Did you always have plenty of supplies?
Yes, we did. And we had enough supplies so that we weren't in need of anything. It wasn't like that at the beginning of the war because they were moving back and forth across the peninsula. They were pushed clear down to the Busan just before we got there. And it was pretty stable after we got there in 1953. And so we didn't have to move around. Just before we left Korea, we moved to Osan. That's a little bit south of Seoul. I don't know if I mentioned it. We stayed in. That was 5th Air Force headquarters. And the 8th Army headquarters was just across the street from us. So we were using university buildings for our headquarters. And when the generals would come into Seoul, why they would meet right there in Seoul. And we got to see quite a few dignitaries come in.
What do you think was your most stressful experience?
Well, I don't know as I really had any stressful experiences except landing there when we first got to Korea. That was pretty stressful. And my father, he had a hernia operation, and he was going to have to sell the cows. And he wanted to know if I wanted to come home and milk the cows and see if I could get an early discharge. And I said, no, I just want to finish up my tour and see what happens afterwards. So I stayed in Korea and finished up my tour. And he had to sell the cows while I was gone.
Do you remember any unusual or humorous events?
Not really. I suppose if you could have time to think about that, there'd be some humorous, but it was pretty serious business.
Did you make any friends while you served?
I hope so. We didn't keep in contact afterwards, but we do have reunions, Air Force reunions, but the people we reunion with now are not the same people that we were in at the same time. My daughter's father-in-law from California was in the Air Weather Service for the Army, and he went to Grand Rapids, Pantlin Hotel, where that was his training base. I was in Chanute Air Force Base, so we went to a few Air Force reunions together, and that was interesting. All the modern technology that's taken place since then.
What are your memories of the day your service ended?
Oh, that was a great day. That was probably one of the best days of my life. But when I woke up the next morning and I wasn't in the service anymore, I wondered, well, what am I supposed to do? There's nobody here to tell me what to do, you know. You had your life all planned before. You knew what you had to do, and here I was free. And I was married at the time, so we had to start looking for a house and things like that.
Where were you?
Where was I when I was discharged?
Yes.
Right, Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. I married a girl that was a nurse, and she was working at Good Samaritan Hospital down there. Right after I was married, I come down with what they thought was hepatitis, but later found out that it wasn't. It was something else. And so I was in the hospital down there in isolation for about 30 days, and she didn't know anybody down there, so that was stressful. I guess you could call that a stressful time. But it worked out all right. We were married in May, just 50 years ago. So this is our 50th anniversary this year.
And what do you remember about homecoming?
My first homecoming was how green everything was. I'd been in Texas for so long, and boy, when I come home in that spring, the trees were so green and dark green, I just couldn't get over it. The seasons are important to me now. Texas is brown almost year-round, and I don't care for the brown. I like green and other colors too, and the seasons are important to me.
When you came back, did you go back to school or get a job?
Well, I tried to go back to school on the GI Bill, but it didn't work out. We had a child, and another one was on its way, and so I started farming, and I started working at different factories, and we kept the farm going, and our family became the focus of our life.
Have you joined a veterans organization?
Yes, I'm a life member of the VFW in Sheridan, and I belong to the American Legion here in Lowell. And the reason I joined in Sheridan was because my brother-in-law belonged there. And so...
What do you do?
What do I do?
Yeah.
I'm not active in either organization. It's just membership. But we do march and parades and things like that on Memorial Day and Labor Day and stuff. And,
Okay, thank you.
you're welcome. Thank you.
I just want to keep rolling for a moment. Ivan, do you have any additional questions that you might like to ask?
Well, one question I always like to ask is how he was in the service for 4 years in a way. How did that time in the service affect the rest of your life?
Well, I don't know. It really made me appreciate our country. My fourth great grandfather fought in the Revolutionary War before this country was the United States. And I found his military record, and I followed all the campaigns he was in. And when we visited out east, we visited all the battle sites, Valley Forge and the White Plains, New York. And it was really amazing that I got a copy of his discharge papers signed by George Washington. And that's a treasure that I can really appreciate. But that was 230 years ago. And we still had a lot of wars since then, so freedom isn't free. You have to work for it.
I do have a question for you. Did your experience in the service affect like how you view perhaps the war that's going on now or any other conflicts that have happened since the time you were in the service?
While I was in the service, the theory was that the communists were going to take all the South East Islands, peninsulas, and take over the world. So communism was world dominion, and we were trying to put a stop to that. But we stopped them in Korea, but then the Chinese come in and the Russians came in, and then it became a test ground for the military. The Russians were testing their jets, and we were testing our jets, and so it's really a police action. And I had a few questions about what if I died over there? What would my life have meant? And I hoped and prayed that it would mean something to somebody, and it did, because the Korean people in the South have really developed their country into a nice metropolitan area, and it's too bad that North Koreans aren't aware of what could be.
Have you gone back there to visit anytime since you've been?
No, I've never had any desire to go back. But one of the striking things that, now that you bring it up, when we landed in Korea and started going through the countryside, it was just like you were going back in history thousands of years. The people were still doing the same type of farming, the same type of labor, stoop labor, planting rice and walking around in the mud and up to their knees. And it was so hard that when a young person become 30 years old, you couldn't tell whether they were 30 or 80. They just aged. It was a hard life. And they didn't have modern transportation. Horse and buggies, horse and carts were the mode of transportation. And when we landed in Japan, if it didn't have wheels on it, why, they were making boats out of them. And they were pulling these little logs around in the harbors and fishing, and that took me back because I wasn't used to seeing sights like that. And they'd farm right up to the edge of the railroad tracks. When we were on the train, there wasn't any shoulder to the railroad tracks. They needed every inch of ground for their food. And Japan is a real populated country, and they needed every inch of ground that they had.
What did you learn about the Korean people while you were there?
They were still trying to carry on their everyday activities. The school, the university was still, they had uniforms so you could tell who the students were. And they had a wall around Seoul to keep Genghis Khan and those marauders out. And I'd never seen a walled city before, but they would build this wall to protect them. And they put broken glass and stuff on top so that they couldn't crawl over the top. And so that was the first walled city I'd seen. But when Genghis Khan was running the country over there, why, he'd wait until they accumulated some treasure, then he'd come back down through and take it all away from him again. So then he'd go back up into Manchuria and wait for a few more years until they accumulated some more treasure. But history became alive to me over there. And if I'd have known as much as I do now about history, I think I would have been a professor of history. And I just can't get enough of history now. It's very interesting.
Do you ladies have any additional questions that you would like to ask? Ivan, do you have any other questions you would like to ask? Mark, you're in late, but do you have anything you'd like to ask?
Yeah.
Clark, you brought, did you bring maps of Korea with you?
No,
Just the weather
I
tape?
brought a map of Hurricane Ivan, the one that hit Gulf Shores. It was the size of Texas, and it really did a lot of damage all along the coast here. And so weather is very, very important today. And they've got, we didn't know anything about jet streams. When we started getting airplanes that would fly high enough, by then they got into jet streams, and El Niños was something new. In 1983, they found out that the cycles of the ocean every 2 to 5 years heats up, and now they've got thermometers out on buoys all across the Pacific to keep track of the El Niños and the temperature. Because of the satellites, they can pick up the readings, and they got solar panels for the batteries to operate these little weather stations. So they got these little weather stations all over the ocean. And microbursts are something new. At airports, you hear about these microbursts. It's an inverted flow of air down. So when these airplanes are coming in and they happen to hit a microburst, they're liable to crash because of the force of the wind coming down, and they don't have the lift. Clear air turbulence is another phenomena that they never knew about. High altitude airplanes are flying, and when they hit that, it's like hitting a rolled. Now they've got radar that can check that out ahead of time so that they can avoid these clear air turbulence. Doppler radar is new. And the ozone depletion, there's just no end to the things that they're learning. And now the job that I had is obsolete because you have to be a meteorologist before you go into the service. They've closed the weather school. You have to be a meteorologist and have your own degree before you go in. And everything is electronic now, radar. And so.
What type of weather did you experience while you were in Korea in the service?
Well, we were just below the 38th parallel, and that's similar to Nashville, Tennessee. But being the mountainous country that it was really, really cold. And one of the classes we had was Know Your Enemy. Well, I thought we were going to learn about the North Koreans and the Chinese and the Russians. But our enemies were frozen feet, bad water, and this sort of thing. So we had to take care of those items too. They could kill you just as quick as the enemy could.
Is there anything else that you would like to add or talk about?
I think I've covered just about everything I can think of. I'm sure that there's other areas that would relate to that. When we did go on a cruise this year, and this is what a weather map looks like. When they connect the dots, you get your pressure areas, your high pressure and low pressure, and ships and airplanes, and everything rely on weather. Farmers, golfers, all kinds of tournaments. So these are the weather maps that they're using today, but this is similar to what we were using when we were in the Air Force.
Now, you obviously have maintained that love of the weather and tracking it.
Oh, yes.
Since
Oh,
that
yes.
time. Did you ever consider, a career in that area after you got out of the service?
Not really, because I wanted to keep the farm going, and it was a fifth-generation farm, and I wanted to be a farmer, and I worked in the factory to keep the farm going, but the farm got the kids through college, so that was important to me.
And the medals that you have there and the emblem on your shoulder, So if you can hold on for a minute.
Okay.
Until we get everything up and running here.
Stone, we might want to do a thank you at the end of the tape, too.
Angie, get don't hit me. Get it closer. Okay, stop it. Stop. You only have, so you need to close it right now.
After he describes the
Just keep your medium shut, because we're all on the bars. A little more. Oh, you're running.
So if you could describe medals and bars. And
Well, I'd have to look it up on my discharge papers, but there's a Korean Service Medal, and there's a UN Service Medal, and there's a Good Conduct Medal. This medal here was given to us last year from Gary Newell as a 50-year anniversary of the Korean War. While we were in basic training, we had to go on the rifle range, and I qualified as an expert. I was a pretty good shot at that time. The 5th Air Force patch meant the Far East Air Force. That was in Asia. The 8th Air Force was located in Europe, so we were in the Asian theater. And I was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time, so I made one stripe every year. I started out as a airman, basic airman, and then a corporal. And when I got back from Korea, I made buck sergeant. And just before I was discharged, they asked me if I was going to re-enlist, and I was thinking about it. I wanted to be on hurricane hunter, be on flying status. I wanted to fly, and then I changed my mind. I got married, and so I didn't follow that up. But I made staff sergeant just before I was discharged.
Thank you for your time and the service to our country.
Thank you very much for the interview. I appreciate it.
thanks.
The following oral military history project is a series of documentaries in association with the Lowell area men and women who proudly served and sacrificed part of their lives to preserve the opportunities for all of us to build our businesses and raise our families under a blanket of freedom. For reservations and more information, contact the Lowell Area Historical Museum at 616-897-7688.